Shalom, Shalom, welcome once again to our Kodago Able channel and to this free Mishnah course, which I hope is enriching your life with knowledge that will help you better see, read, study, and interpret every passage of the Bible you encounter. Let us remember that the Mishnah is the key that gives life and context to the biblical scriptures so we can understand them in their original context, to the extent possible, because it is certainly a complicated and arduous task. However, with the help of all extra-biblical literature and a Hebrew and academic perspective, we can get as close as possible to the original message of the prophets and biblical figures. With that said, and introducing myself, I am Abel Flores speaking to you, and so we begin today's class. This is what today's Mishnah teaching says in Berakhot 3:3. Women, slaves, and minors are exempt from reciting the Shema and wearing phylacteries, tefillin, but they're obligated to pray, wear the mezuzah, and recite the blessing after meals. Now we will begin a thorough, detailed, and comprehensive study of this Mishnah Berakhot 3:3 and all its related themes, paying special attention to the context of the 1st and 2nd centuries during the Second Temple period, and the decades immediately following, such as the time of the Talmudic sages, and what it meant to be a woman, a slave, or serf, and a minor for religious, halakhic, obligations at that time. Our Mishnah to be studied reads as follows: women, slaves, and minors are exempt from reciting the Shema and wearing phylacteries, but are obligated to pray, tefillah, wear the mezuzah, and make the blessing after meals, known in Hebrew as Birkat Hamazon. A very important point here is that this Mishnah relates to the halakhic idea, that is, how to apply the Torah's commandments in life. It deals more generally with the positive mitzvah with time, from which certain people, women, slaves, and minors, were exempt. For example, in Mishnah Kiddushin 1:7 it says, all the mitzvot that depend on the father, men are obligated, women are exempt. All the positive mitzvot that have a time restriction, men are obligated, and women are exempt. In the Talmud, in Berakhot 20a, 20b, this Mishnah is discussed and explained. The first thing to understand here is, what does exempt versus obliged mean? In halakhic language, exempt in Hebrew, patur, means that they are not legally obligated to fulfill that commandment. They are not required to do so, either in theory or under religious legal penalty from rabbinic authority. Being obligated in Hebrew, chayav, means that the law requires its fulfillment. There is a halakhic, i.e., rabbinic normative duty, and the person has a moral and religious responsibility in this regard. A distinction is also made between positive commandments, do something, and negative commandments, do not do something, and between those that are time-restricted and those that are not. The Shema and phylacteries, tefillin, are considered positive, time-restricted mitzvot. They must be performed at certain times of the day. In contrast, daily prayer, the mezuzah, and the blessing after meals are not all bound to a specific time, or at least in the Mishnah, they are considered to be in a different category. This framework is part of what the Talmud discusses. To understand all this, we must take a journey back in time to understand the historical, social, and cultural context of the 1st and 2nd centuries, which is the era of the Mishnah. This will help us understand why the sages established these exemptions. It is essential to situate them in their time, because through the lens of the 21st century, this is segregation, but 2,000 years ago it was obvious. The general context of Second Temple Judaism and the time of the Tanaitic sages is that in the Second Temple period, from the rebuilding of the temple by Ezra and Nehemiah in biblical times around 515 BC, until its destruction in 70 BCE by the Roman Empire and beyond, religious authority resides in the synagogues and rabbinical schools, and oral texts begin to formalize, leading to the Mishnah around 200 BC. Thus, the social structure of Judaism was strongly marked by religious roles, status, tribe, ritual cleanliness, and purity/impurity. Whether we like it or not, the reality is that there were social divisions: free men versus slaves, and serfs, citizens with rights, women and minors, and children. Religious, legal, and social obligations differed for each group. In the economy, agriculture dominated, as did regional trade and religious taxes, with very distinct family roles. Women were typically in the home, with domestic responsibilities, although they might have certain property or inheritance rights depending on the rank and circumstances of their families. Slaves had an intermediate status, not full citizens, but under legal protection in certain aspects. Their role depended on the master. Minors depended on a father or guardian. Their legal capacity was limited. Religion had two aspects, one public and one private. Although few know this, at this time there was also private law and individualism. Religious law regulated not only temple rituals, but also domestic practices, such as the mezuzah or doorposts, the reading of the Shema, and the daily donning of tefillin. The Jewish community was very focused on daily ritual observance. But what was the status of women, slaves, and minors? Here are some specific aspects regarding women. In most sources, a Jewish woman was a free woman, born to Jewish parents. Her civil rights depended on Roman jurisdiction and Jewish law. Single women, married women, and widows had different statuses. They did not participate in priestly functions, legal leadership positions, or temple rituals, for example, priestly service. Formal Torah education existed, but less so than for men. They were dependent on their father, family, or husband. For example, in the school of Shema, just as Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, the first sage cited by the Mishnah, who was excommunicated, etc., did not teach Torah to women, only about the commandments they had to fulfill, that is, the commandments that applied only to women. But Hillel's school was more open, teaching that fathers to their daughters and husbands to their wives could teach Torah to women according to their individual understanding. But what was the status of women, slaves, and minors? Here are some specific aspects regarding women. In most sources, a Jewish woman was a free woman, born to Jewish parents. Her civil rights depended on Roman jurisdiction and Jewish law. Single women, married women, and widows had different statuses. They did not participate in priestly functions, legal leadership positions, or temple rituals, for example, priestly service. Formal Torah education existed, but less so than for men. They were dependent on their father, family, or husband. For example, in the school of Shema, just as Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, the first sage cited by the Mishnah, who was excommunicated, etc., did not teach Torah to women, only about the commandments they had to fulfill, that is, the commandments that applied only to women. But Hillel's school was more open, teaching that fathers to their daughters and husbands to their wives could teach Torah to women according to their individual understanding. Riot's tasks. They lived under the master's rules. Their conditions could vary greatly. Some served in the home, others performed hard labor, and others might have limited freedom or eventual emancipation, in certain cases, from a Hebrew slave to the Jubilee. In other words, the Hebrew or Jewish slave had a better status in Israel than the Gentile slave, because the Torah of Moses promotes continued freedom for the Hebrew slave until he is freed. Even a Jew, that is, one of his coreligionists, could pay for his freedom. In fact, this is a commandment of the Torah of Moses, to free your fellow Israelite from slavery. Regarding religious obligations, they depended on the slave status. Some commandments applied to them, others did not. Regarding the Shema and tefillin, the Mishnah exempts them, probably by analogy with women and minors, regarding mitzvah with a time restriction. However, they are obligated in other commandments that do not have a time restriction. If you haven't seen the class on the most famous slave in the Mishnah, Tavi, the slave of Rabban Gamliel, you should watch that class, which is on the video list on our YouTube channel, and you will understand much more about what is happening here. And in the third case mentioned in this Mishnah, regarding minors, children, youth, the condition at that time was that they were minors until they reached bar/bat mitzvah, although the institution of bar mitzvah as a ceremony developed later. But as a ceremony. At that time, a child of the commandment, which is what bar mitzvah means, was a young man of 13 years of age, although they were still limited in other respects. For example, a soldier of Israel, according to the law of Moses, was 20 years old, not before. Those under 13 were dependent on their parents for education, food, and protection. Their legal status did not make them fully responsible for religious obligations at the level of a free adult. They were economically dependent. They were not responsible for household maintenance, heavy labor, taxes, and full legal obligations. They also could not marry before reaching the age of bar mitzvah, which was 13 for boys and 12 for girls. Religiously, they were expected to learn, prepare, and participate in certain community rituals, but they were not morally or legally obligated to those commandments that demand maturity and full responsibility. Once they reached adulthood, they were held accountable. Regarding Torah study, children began reading the Torah from the age of 5. In fact, they learned to read by reading the Torah scroll, and this began at age 5. From approximately 7 or 8 years old, depending on the child's understanding, they began studying the Mishnah through oral tradition from their parents and teachers. So, in theory, by the time they were 13, they knew how to read the Torah and at least knew many of the Mishnah by heart. Torah study, that is, what would later be known as the Gemara in the Talmud, began this stage with the bar mitzvah because it was at this point that the weight of most of the commandments fell upon this adolescent. But let's ask ourselves this question. Why do the sages exempt these groups from reciting the Shema and wearing tefillin/phylacteries? This is due to several halakhic, theological, and practical factors. Positive commandments with a time restriction, mitzvah to say shehazmin jerama. This is a principle that appears in the Mishnah, such as in Kiddushin 1:7, and was implemented by the sages. Certain commandments that can only be performed at specific times of the day are legally assigned only to free adult males. The Shema, e.g., morning and evening recitation, tefillin, among others, are classified in this category. Women, slaves, and minors are exempt from these mitzvot. Intellectual capacity, obligation to learn, and religious responsibility. The sages assumed that to be obligated, one must have a certain maturity, knowledge, ability to understand what one is doing, and personal responsibility. Minors are not yet fully mature. Slaves and women may have been considered less capable of assuming these obligations due to social limitations on their time, their learning role, and their domestic role. Remember that this happened because the society of those times, 2,000 years ago, was very different from today's postmodernism, with the internet, and a society where women have full civil rights, at least in theory, because today, unfortunately, we sometimes suffer from a lot of machismo. In ancient times, the daily burden of life, physical labor, domestic responsibilities, was much greater, especially for women and slaves. Demanding strict adherence to time-sensitive commandments can be very burdensome. Furthermore, the wise tried to avoid imposing obligations that people could not fulfill, which could lead to unwitting transgression or neglect of other obligations. Don't think that cooking and washing in those days were the same as today with a washing machine and dryer. Cooking often involved the woman herself killing the animal, such as a chicken, and washing meant walking to a river and back. Some religious obligations were constant, while others depended on specific times or places. Daily prayer, mezuzah, and the blessing after meals are ongoing obligations that can be performed at many times and are not tied to a rigid schedule. Therefore, it was recognized that even those exempt from the commandments for a time would still have to fulfill these other obligations. Therefore, the Mishnah specifies that women, slaves, and minors are exempt from Shema and tefillin, but not from prayer, mezuzah, and the blessing after meals. Regarding the specific context of the Second Temple period and the 1st and 2nd centuries, to understand why the sages believed that women, slaves, and minors should not be obligated in these rituals, it is useful to examine how they actually lived, what their role and expectations were. Regarding women, what was their religious education? Sources show that some women learned Torah, but the formal education system was geared toward men. At that time, there were no schools for Jewish women, as there are today. They are called Bet Yaakov, like the house of Jacob for unmarried girls or adolescents, and Midrashot for married women. But 2,000 years ago, this was not the case. Many of the obligations of speaking, studying, or reciting public texts were beyond the normal reach of women. In family roles, women were in charge of the home, cooking, washing, weaving, caring for children, keeping the house clean according to ritual norms of food purity, nida, laws of menstruation. They played an important role in domestic religious observance, but their time was very busy because, among other things, there were no household appliances, and having a servant at that time was something exclusive to the wealthy. Participation in public rituals, generally limited. They did not enter the temple for certain priestly services, nor did they wear tefillin as per the norm, but it was optional, which is why today in Reform Judaism groups there are rabbis who wear tefillin. At that time, women did not ritually recite Shema in synagogues in the same way as men. They were designated by legal obligation. Regarding the legal status of women under Jewish law, women had rights, dowry, protection of their livelihood, but also different obligations. Under Roman rule, there was also influence from the surrounding culture on civil rights. The context of the slaves was that there were several types of slaves. There is a distinction between Hebrew slaves and Canaanite slaves, more external, with fewer rights. Slaves were often not free people. They were totally dependent on the master, performing physical labor and domestic service. Their position in society was that slaves were not expected to participate in public leadership roles, formal education, or have much free time for observances that depend on free time or ease of fulfillment. Therefore, the sages of the time removed this burden of fulfilling certain commandments from Hebrew slaves. Although there were applicable exceptions, when the slave has a certain autonomy or time, he may perform certain mitzvah. But the general halakhic rule is exemption from mitzvah with time restrictions. In the Gemara, there is a later halakhic analysis between the 3rd and 7th century CE. In the Gemara in Berakhot 20a, 20b, these exemptions are examined, offering arguments, discussions of borderline cases, and explanations. There is debate about exactly why they are exempt, which mitzvot are time restricted, and what kind of time ordained by day and by event. It also examines whether these groups can voluntarily assume the obligation, or whether they can voluntarily wear tefillin even if they are exempt. In many cases, halacha allows someone who is exempt to perform the mitzvah voluntarily, even if they are not obligated, as, for example, was the case with Rabban Gamliel's slave, Tavi. There is discussion about whether poverty or occupation, hard labor, can exempt a man due to practical difficulty. But in general, the exemption of women, slaves, and minors does not depend on their occupation, but on their status by birth or social status in that ancient period. Now, we will enter the final phase of this class with a rigorous study of illiteracy and literacy levels in Second Temple Judaism, its impact on Torah study, and, in particular, on the recitation of the Shema, with its 2 before and 2 after blessings, as we studied in previous classes, which you can enjoy in our video playlist on our YouTube channel. Illiteracy affected women, slaves, and minors. And this involved reading/reciting the Shema at the time. How could this happen if most people couldn't read? The Mishnah regulated the liturgical structure. In the morning, 2 blessings before the Shema and 1 after. At night, 2 before and 2 after, 1 long and 1 short. This is explicit in Mishnah Berakhot 1:4, which we already studied in this course. For this reason, among others, there are 2 Talmudic principles that mitigated the barrier of illiteracy, and both apply to this day. The Shema can be recited in any understood language. There is a dispute in Berakhot 13a. However, Shachamim allow any language, which reduces the dependence on Hebrew literacy. And the second principle is Shomea Kuan, one who hears this as if he recited, a general principle that allows one to fulfill certain obligations by listening to a qualified reader/official who relieves you of hoba or obligation. This is the case, for example, of the chazan, the cantor of the prayers in the synagogue. By his merit, if you listen to his prayer, he relieves you of your obligation, as long as he has that intention and kavana. That is to say, at that time, even without full literacy, communal praxis, and officiant reading, fixed responses, memorization, allowed the Shema liturgy to be performed with its blessings. Also, remember that at that time, there were Jewish men and women who perhaps spoke Hebrew but couldn't read it, or perhaps many, believe it or not, could speak and read Greek or Aramaic, but not Hebrew. In all of these cases, in one way or another, there was a significant level of Hebrew illiteracy. In the Greco-Roman world of that time, mass literacy was unthinkable, literacy rates were low, often less than 10 and 15%, with a strong urban/elite bias. In Judea and Galilee, literacy was stratified and functional, concentrated among literate elites, scribes, leaders, merchants, and in specific contexts, legal writing, commerce, worship. There is no evidence of universal schooling during this period. There is material evidence. At Qumran, there was a specialized writing culture, library/archive, scribe training, which does not imply widespread literacy throughout society, but rather literate nuclei. Perhaps to help you understand the context, for a person, even a free Jew, knowing how to read at that time was as difficult as knowing how to program today. Ask yourself how many people in your circle know how to program computer software today. Well, at that time, it was also difficult to find someone who knew how to read, and even more difficult to write. The majority of the Jewish population of the 1st and 2nd centuries was not fluent in reading. They knew how to listen, memorize, and repeat formulas. Synagogue and domestic worship compensated with oral tradition, the vernacular language, and an official reader. That's why the famous Targum of Onkelos, an Aramaic version of the Hebrew text of the Torah, was used at that time. Why? Because at that time, few people, even free Jews, understood Hebrew. Rather, they used Aramaic as their vernacular. Now, before ending this class, and taking advantage of the fact that we still have a few minutes, let's learn the biography of one of the great rabbis of the Mishnah, who so far has been mentioned only once in this Mishnah course, in that teaching about the 2 blessings added before the Shema and the 2 after the Shema. Although he has only been mentioned once in the Mishnah, and we are already in chapter 3.3. By getting to know this Torah sage, you will understand much more about what was happening at that time, and from the 2nd temple onward, when the temple was still standing. Let's now talk about Rabbi Meir, one of the most prominent to name, Mishnaic sages. His full name appears in sources as Meir Baal Haines, the one who works miracles, a later popular epithet. He was a disciple of the famous Rabbi Akiva and lived in the second half of the 2nd century, immediately after the Berakhot revolt, 132 to 135 AD. During the transition period between the destruction of the Second Temple and the consolidation of rabbinic and diasporic Judaism, let us always remember the historical context. After the destruction of the Temple in 70 AD by Titus and the Roman repression, the oral Torah became the center of Jewish life. In this context, Rabbi Meir stands out as a bridge between his teacher Rabbi Akiva and the generation of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the famous Tanakhama or redactor and, above all, editor of the Mishnah. According to sources, after the death of many of Akiva's students, Meir, along with Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yoz, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Shammua, rebuilt the chain of transmission of the oral Torah in southern Israel. He also studied with Elisha ben Avuya, Aker, or the Stranger, a teacher who strayed from orthodoxy by studying Kabbalah and going mad. Sources, Babylonian Talmud, Chagiga 15a, tell us that Rabbi Meir continued to learn from him even after he fell away, eating the fruit and discarding the peel, a metaphor for taking the wisdom and discarding the negative from Elisha ben Avuya. This relationship demonstrates Rabbi Meir's intellectual breadth and discernment. In Eruvin 13b of the Talmud, it is stated, Anonymous Mishnah, Stam Mishnah, is Rabbi Meir because Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, when compiling the Mishnah, often redacted teachings of Rabbi Meir without mentioning his name. This gave Meir a silent but omnipresent presence. That is to say, every Mishnah we have studied so far, and those that with God's help we will study in the future, that do not have a citation or a parent author, are actually teachings of Rabbi Meir, but his disciple Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the redactor, did not cite him so that all the Mishnayot would not be attributed to the same author, because that would make no sense to the debate. But why are the anonymous Mishnayot attributed to him? Rabbi Meir had an extraordinary memory and organizational ability. It is said that he knew 300 halakhic about foxes, Eruvin 13b, a metaphor for his vast knowledge. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi valued his systematic style. When he composed the Mishnah, he used many of Meir's formulations as a basis. Therefore, when the Mishnah quotes unattributed texts, tradition assumes that he is Rabbi Meir. For example, today we study Berakhot 3:3, and that Mishnah does not quote any sage, so it means that the entire Mishnah is literally from the mouth of Rabbi Meir. He had a dialectical style. He presented arguments for and against, mastering both his own and opposing opinions, to the point that the Talmud says he could purify the impure and defile the pure with 150 arguments, a metaphor for his capacity for logical analysis. He insisted on the precision of the Mishnah and on organizing the halakhic according to pedagogical criteria. In Pirkei Avot 4:10, Rabbi Meir is quoted as saying, "Be lax in your studies, but multiply them. Be humble before all." He taught to judge each person favorably, Avot of Rabbi Nathan. He promoted joy and trust in God, hence the nickname Bal Hanes, linked to miracles and salvation. Buried in Tiberias, his tomb in Israel is a site of pilgrimage today. Tradition calls him Rabbi Meir Bal Hanes, and post-mortem miracles are attributed to him, such as a tzaddik who intervenes on behalf of people through his merit to help others from the spiritual world, because, as Kabbalah teaches, the merit of a tzaddik, of a righteous person, is that even after death they do not lose consciousness and continue to help the living. The Talmud narrates episodes where Rabbi Meir acted cunningly before the Romans, escaping in disguise so that they would not kill him for fulfilling the Torah. These stories reinforce his image as a resourceful sage. He had a prodigious memory. According to tradition, he could remember thousands of halakhic. This explains why his oral legacy dominated the Mishnah. He had a wise wife named Beruria, also a scholar, an exceptional figure of a scholarly woman in rabbinic literature. His contributions appear in several sagiot of the Talmud, Berakhot 10a, Pesachim 62b. This marriage illustrates his unique intellectual milieu. In other words, Rabbi Meir taught his wife everything he knew, something revolutionary for his time. In fact, his wife is one of the few women cited in the Talmud. In conclusion, Rabbi Meir was a second-generation Tannite, a disciple of Akiva, a survivor of the Bar Kochba rebellion, one of the few, in fact, who also systematized vast amounts of halakhic and whose dialectical style fascinated later rabbis. His apparent anonymity in the Mishnah is, in fact, proof of his centrality. When the Mishnah speaks without attribution, it often speaks in his voice, the voice of Rabbi Meir. His traits, prodigious memory, intellectual openness, even with those excommunicated like Elisha ben Avoya, a learned wife, miracles attributed posthumously, make him one of the most special and charismatic sages of classical Judaism and one of the pillars of Kabbalah as the most profound and mystical study of the Torah of Moses.